Hi Omera, really thank you for coming here today, and we're going to now talk about supply chain resilience. But before we do that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about yourself because you have a very strong academic background.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Samantha. Really happy to be here. Yes, I joined Maersk around 14 months ago as Head of Supply Chain Insights and Trends Lab. And prior to joining Maersk, I was a professor in logistics and supply chain management. Spent most of my academic career in UK universities before coming to Denmark Technical University, and hence how I ended up moving here to Denmark.
And a little birdie tells me, actually from a young age, you actually have some experience or some exposure when it comes to supply chain.
Yes, I do. I grew up in a family of textile manufacturers. So I had exposure to supply chain and procurement before I even knew what supply chain and procurement was. So very much at an early stage, growing up on factory floors or in production and watching my parents build up the business, I very quickly got the the feeling or the desire to actually go into business myself. And it's probably no surprise that then many years later, I embarked on choosing textile design as my bachelor, as my bachelor degree, because at that time I thought, well, I was going to join the family business. And then after that, I got a scholarship though to join what was then the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology to do a master in philosophy, but I chose to do it on the subject of design procurement in the textile industry. Okay. So I wanted to further explore some of the dynamics of when we make purchasing decisions for our customers, how do our customers choose to actually buy the designs that they buy? And actually many years after that, when I did my PhD, it also became the theme of my PhD study, because I then looked into supply chain risk and resilience, of which actually design played a really prominent role, because one of the contributions of my thesis was actually looking at how the supply chain begins on the drawing board, meaning that the decisions that we take at that very early stage have huge implications for risk and for complexity, for agility and so forth. And that then naturally somehow transitioned me away from the business world. But after doing a PhD, I was asked to join Cranfield University, who were, along with MIT at the time, pioneering in research in supply chain risk and resilience. So I ended up becoming an academic as opposed to the business world that I had dreamed of.
But now it's come full circle, so you're back in the business world here at Maersk. What you just touched upon is really critical for the discussion that we're about to have today. So can you tell us, what are some of the key learnings that we have sort of gathered looking at these supply chain disruptions over the last few years, and how can that enable us to make sort of supply chain recovery choices?
Recent years have been a bruising period for supply chains, but I would see them as a wake call. I think it's time for a reset for many organizations. But over the years, as we started developing global supply chains, we also started embedding a lot of complexity naturally within these global supply chains. And what that means is now we're far more interconnected in our global supply chains than we've ever been before, but therefore that also means we're a lot more exposed to risks than ever before. So I think now, I would say in recent years, because of the causation effects of lots of risks that we're seeing, there's a greater recognition now that we need to develop more resilience in our supply chains, as opposed to just looking at operational risk management, which I think used to be more of the attention of senior leaders in organizations.
And it seems to be at such a critical level, because we've even had, President Biden recently, now because of these supply chain woes plaguing the US supply chain, he's now actually appointing a supply chain resilience officer. Has it got to that level now that even it's not just at a company level but government levels, that it's reaching a point that something has to be done?
Yes, I think it's the right decision by Biden to appoint a supply chain resilience officer, and I'm really happy to see that. I think there's a greater realization now that we need to think about our policy and our government decisions also around resilience. I think we have to develop a resilient infrastructure, because if we don't have the government and the policymakers behind organizations, and particularly SMEs form the vital part of global supply chains. And if we look at what businesses have had to go through in the last few years, they need a lot of support, and that reform comes from government. So the fact that there's a now growing recognition at the government levels that, look, this is something that is here to stay, it's long lasting, and we need to develop an approach that will hopefully support the resilience of our supply networks. I think that can only be a good thing.
You've spoken about beyond recovery, we actually need to look at regeneration. Can you tell me a little bit more about this?
When we fall or we fail or there's a disruption, we think about recovery, right? How do we kind of bounce back? And we can almost say that links with resilience. But I think regeneration is actually about giving a little bit more back than what we take from the world. But for me, I think regeneration is also about mindsets, it's about attitudes, it's about culture. And I think in a world where now sustainability has become much more of a bigger imperative, I think in supply chains we now need to take that view of not just, resilience in the way we do things, but it's also about resilience and regeneration. We've got to look at that, the choices that we make in our supply chains, how are they impacting the planet, how they impact in the world. And I know that these are difficult decisions to make in times when we are grappling with costs and inflation and so on. But I think that there's no doubt in my mind that as we go forward, and particularly companies such as ours, Maersk, when we have such a strong and a big brand name, we can really help the rest of our supply chain partners think more about the greater good for what we do through our supply chain decisions.
And also it's decisions that have to be made now. They can't be put off indefinitely because there's not an endless or infinite sort of resources out there. And we know as well where some of our sort of supplies are coming from, there's also maybe political issues coming up in the future that if we don't tackle them now, they're not going to have sort of robust enough businesses, I would say.
Absolutely. And we look at this in our supply chain and insight trends lab. We look at this through what we call a polycrisis framework. So we look at different lenses like geopolitical, technology and the environment. We look at our competition and our customers, for example, as a framework. And it's those sub-trends and the interconnectivity between those sub-trends. So for example, we look at decarbonization and circularity and green logistics. Are they being caused by the shift of diversification of global supply chains or the need for greater resilience? Or are they being governed actually by regenerative approaches that we want to take through being better on the planet? But then is that linked to, regionalization because our customers are now seeking resilience in a post-COVID world? So it's the interconnectivity of these trends that becomes really important. But I think that going forward, you're absolutely right. We live in a world with finite resources. And we at Maersk, we were the first to launch our decarbonized vessel, for example. We're doing this throughout our supply chain, through our eco-delivery products as well. And we're also supporting our customers to show them, leading by example, on how we can further drive down our, decarbonization agenda, because we recognize how important it is that we put back on the planet that we also take out. So I think that if we can collectively create an ecosystem that can be regenerative, that can be resilient, we no longer need to just think about recovery because it's an ecosystem that will help be better to the planet, but also our customers with the value that they seek from us.
Now, being the academic, a recent report by McKinsey, and I'll quote them here, stated that companies can address risks by reconsidering those outdated short-term strategies and actually beginning the hard work of building structural resilience. But what does this translate to in the real world and in current terms?
Risk is often a one-off event, and by focusing just on risk, we can end up taking a very narrow view. It's often quite short-termist, so a risk occurs, we deal with it, but it gives us this recency bias. Resilience is a lot more taking a long-term view, and when we think about structural resilience, I believe the McKinsey report is probably referring to this idea of developing, moving from dynamic capabilities to structural capabilities, and that is our organization structurally capable of withstanding any risk that when it occurs, we are able to still operate as usual. Now that sounds quite simple when you say it, but it's actually a lot more complex to deliver in the real world. So I think that the focus here must be on resilience, as we mentioned earlier.
Resilient supply chain solutions are being looked at from many different academic lenses, and one such lens was talked upon in a Forbes article earlier this year. And it said risk-resilient supply chains create dynamic digital connections across all your suppliers, contract manufacturers, logistics partners and service providers. It then goes on to say these digital connections will facilitate fast, intuitive collaboration on demand. But if I'm sort of a business company owner, what do you think that they should prioritize before we get to this sort of idealistic scenario?
We have to remember that technology is an enabler for supply chain. An enabler, it's to help aid our supply chain decision making. So I think first and foremost, it's very important to understand, let's just get to the basics, right? Let's understand the basics. What is it that we don't already know that we want this data to support us with? Because once we understand what we don't know in our supply chains, then we can start using that data to help us understand what we need to know. When we know what we need to know, when we understand that better, we will be better able to serve our customers. So I think that technology is there, and data needs to be the right kind of data, right? And we're now seeing the use of large language-based models and generative AI, for example, to help us structure data, because ultimately our goal is to improve visibility in our supply chains. So how can we do that? Well, we need to unfuzz some of the fuzzy data from the data that we actually need. So I think ultimately it's about understanding, look, how do we better sense the demand from our customers and then translate that demand into a value proposition to best serve our customers? My simple answer would be, let's just get the basics right and understand what are we using the technologies for in the first place to enable improved supply chain management, to optimize our supply chains.
So thank you for, I think, a final question. So we're coming to the end of the year and a lot of attention is going to be made on the trends for next year. What do you see as some of like the key factors, the key areas that are trending that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I think particularly for our industry, I think the transition from a linear economy to a circular economy, and specifically for Maersk, looking at reverse logistics, I think will be one of the biggest trends, not just for Maersk, actually for all logistics service providers.
Can you expand a little bit upon reverse logistics, just for some of our audience members out there?
Yeah. So reverse logistics, actually, it's not just simply about returning goods after a consumer has used them to waste. Reverse logistics is enhancing the circular supply chains, basically, which is to say that we focus on taking products once they have been used back to the midpoint of our supply chain to be recirculated back into an ecosystem where they can be either refurbished or repurposed or remanufactured and repaired to circulate back into a supply chain process and be reused again. So for example, in our lifestyle and our fashion vertical, it could be about repairing goods now to be used, pre-loved clothing, for example. We're seeing the rise of that, right? So this is very much not driven just by choice or because we all want to be good to the planet. Of course, that's a big part of it, but actually it's a lot of the legislations are now driving us towards this. And I think for our industry as a whole, particularly where we're focusing on achieving net zero targets, circularity is a really big way of achieving that. And I think that will be a big trend for all industries going forward.
We look forward to diving a little bit deeper into that trend in our next discussion, which will be, of course, on the circular economy. But I would love to, of course, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking us through supply chain resilience, and hopefully from what the insights that you shared, companies, whether they're big or small sort of traders, can really apply some of those lessons that you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.